Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go.
Done a lot of work on advocacy, COVID advocacy, not necessarily all long COVID advocacy, but also focused on prevention, on informing people, educating people on all the science. I don't have a background in science, though. I actually have a background in communications, and I've worked as a photographer for years. So yeah, I kind of rolled into this.
And I'm Jeremy Rossman. I'm the president of Research Aid Networks, which is a nonprofit organization that is really focused on being that bridge between sort of the scientific and research community and what is happening on the ground in communities, community activism, community supporting organizations, humanitarian aid, really on a broad spectrum, but really trying to be that bridge between science and the community. And through that, we've been working on a lot of COVID pandemic-related actions, now working a lot on pandemic preparedness, and have been doing a lot on the long COVID field. I'm also an honorary senior lecturer of virology at the University of Kent and have been doing all sorts of virology and immunology research for quite a few years now.
Amazing. And I love this because you're absolutely right. Before I became involved in long COVID and the long COVID world and starting to speak to researchers and people who were involved in that world, researchers were like up on this massive pedestal and they were super smart people with like gazillions of letters after their names and, white coats, goggles, like super duper sort of unobtainable smart people. And, not that you're not, but I think, as you say, this kind of how do you link that to like quote unquote the people? Research has obviously got to be done by researchers, but it also, as we're starting to understand more, needs to involve the people whom the research is being done for. And then that needs to be communicated to those people and I'm sure loads of other people as well. So although research may be done by like the super smart people, it's not in isolation, is it? And I think that's a very kind of powerful thing to be able to communicate that to people who aren't researchers.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole idea is to try and break down that barrier between research and the community. And obviously we still need things like research objectivity and stuff like that, but there's so much of research that can directly benefit different communities, but there's also so much information and knowledge within the community that is essential for designing really good research. So this needs to work in both directions, and there's so much that can be mutually beneficial here, but there's a real need for that bridge, and that's what we're trying to work on.
Yeah, and I guess like joining the two is probably not as easy as it sounds. It's not just kind of being like, hey, person A meet person B, because I imagine that those people maybe can't communicate very easily because they're in two very different worlds. Is that true?
Yes, although sometimes it really is as easy as just introducing people to each other, making that connection. But I guess this really brings us to kind of my role which is I also work as a facilitator for the network that we started. So I think it's useful to talk a little bit about that, because that's really how our collaborative work all started. So I got sick with COVID in March 2020, and I developed long COVID. And back then, nobody was talking about it. And so I started speaking out first in my own country, but from the Netherlands, it's a tiny country. And so I tried to kind of get an idea of if there were others like me who had these long-term symptoms, and there were, but they were all abroad. At the same time, it was clear to me that, I was 28 at the time. If I was having long-term symptoms, there's most likely a gigantic group of people who were struggling with the same thing. And this meant to me that what the government was saying at the time, which was that this virus was only affecting elderly people and people with underlying diseases, that wasn't true, and that there was a real need to do more about prevention. And so I really decided to start speaking out, to see what I can do to get the word out there, to get the correct information out there. But like I said, I'm from a small country, and so I did connect with a bunch of Dutch advocacy groups who were already working on the topic, and I joined one. But it was clear that to really make a dent, I really had to connect more internationally. And I was kind of looking for others, maybe like a network of groups of people, bringing people together. But there wasn't really a network like that was doing any like effective collaboration or collaborative work, trying to initiate that. And so after a while of searching, I decided to start it myself. And Jeremy was one of the people who joined the network quite early on. I connected with Jeremy online. He was one of the first people who I spoke to who really confirmed that there were all these other diseases that also had long-term symptoms, but that wasn't really spoken about as much. And so to me, that was that confirmation, and also the start of a very fruitful collaboration from that point on out. And so I decided to start a overarching kind of collaborative network for COVID-focused groups from around the world. So that could either be long COVID groups or people that focused on prevention, people that focused on education, anyone, but mostly community groups, with the idea of connecting into researchers to really make sure that that information was disseminated. Because at the time it wasn't. And so going back to your comment, I work as a facilitator to really connect those researchers with the community groups, to help the community groups with whatever they're working on, which is a very wide range of projects. And we actually recently relaunched the network, and so we're back at it again, and we're at the moment recruiting new partners, trying to kind of see what is needed now in this phase of the pandemic.
I think certainly from a long COVID perspective, I was also a March 2020-er. Is that even a word? And that feeling at the start that it was just you. There's all this stuff in the news about COVID and people are talking about the death toll, and like that was terrifying in itself. But nobody was talking about the people who survived but didn't get better. So, there was that feeling of isolation, and, that continued because, medical care was quite difficult to get at that point. And I think, the kind of overarching thing that I've really noticed all the way through my experience with long COVID and even beyond is that communication isn't there. There's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of things that are helping people. There's a lot of research that people can get involved in. There's so much information, but it's not reaching people, or it's certainly not reaching all of the people it should be. It's reaching people because they're kind of going out to look for it rather than because it's being signposted to them by doctors or whoever it is that they're going to. So, it sounds like, that's kind of part of the reason I think things like the podcast is so important. But, even so, you only find a podcast if someone tells you it's there or if you go looking for it. So it's still that kind of problem of being signposted, isn't it? And I think, again, this idea of isolation and, just connecting with people is just something that is so important, whether you're sick and feeling isolated and needing someone to talk to, or whether you're a doctor who's looking to collaborate with other doctors, or a researcher who's looking to collaborate with other researchers or doctors or patients or whoever it is. It's that, connection. And how wonderful is it that the three of us are here in like 3 different countries and we're connecting? I just think that's wonderful.
And it's great that it's possible.
It's one of the really powerful things that has really come to light during the course of the pandemic, is that despite also the immense difficulties and challenges, there's also been this new level of connection and collaboration and people coming together to really work on very complicated, very different things from very different backgrounds. And that's been incredibly powerful.
Yeah, what you said just now about the signposting, and that even if you have a podcast, it's still dependent on a person sending it to someone that they want to actually listen to it. Well, that's actually the reason why the approach behind the network from the very first moment was to work with community groups, people who want to take action within their own community or nationally. We never had the idea that it was us doing the work. We were just here to support in whatever way we can, because a message is always so much better received coming from a trusted person in a community. And so it was really up to us to support them in their projects, or support them personally is also an important thing to mention, because doing advocacy is difficult, and the pandemic is, of course, very hard on people emotionally as well. And so it's not just specific sharing of resources, for example, that we do. It's also providing organizational support as well as just personal support for the advocates involved.
We'll be right back.